Happy Tuesday, everybody. This is Alive and Thriving. I am your host, Nathaniel J., and we will be reading today from Chapter 3, Book 2, Baird T. Spalding's Life and Teaching of the Masters of the Far East. Without further ado, let's jump right in. Day after day for 2 months, with the old man as our instructor, we gave our whole attention to a set of tablets which dealt entirely with characters, symbols, and their position, plan, and meaning. One morning, early in March, we went to the room in the temple as usual and found the old gentleman lying on the couch as though asleep. One of our party walked over and placed a hand on his arm to arouse him, then started back and exclaimed, "He is not breathing. I believe he is dead." We gathered around the couch and were so absorbed in our own thoughts of death among these people that we did not hear anyone enter. We were aroused from our reverie by a voice saying, "Good morning." We turned toward the door and there stood Emil. We had supposed that he was 1,000 miles away and his sudden appearance had startled us. Before we had time to compose ourselves, he walked over and was shaking hands all around. In a moment, Emil walked to the couch on which the old man was lying. Placing his hand upon the old man's head, he said, "Here we have a dear brother who has departed from this earth, but has not been able to finish his work among us. As one of your poets has said, he has wrapped his mantle about him and has lain down to pleasant dreams." In other words, you have pronounced him dead. Your first thought is to get an undertaker and a coffin, to prepare a grave to hide his mortal part of him while it dissolves. Dear friends, kindly think for a moment. To whom did Jesus speak when he said, "Father, I thank thee that thou hast heard me"? He was not talking to the outer self, the me, the shell. He was recognizing and praising the inner self, the one infinite, the all-hearing, all-knowing, all-seeing, the great and mighty, omnipresent God. Can you not see where the eyes of Jesus were turned as he stood at the tomb of Lazarus? Did he, like you, look into that tomb and see a dead and dissolving Lazarus? While your vision was upon the dead, he held his vision upon the living, the only begotten of God. His vision was fixed upon the unchangeable, eternal, omnipresent life, and that life transcends all. Now, with our vision held steadfastly toward that ever-present reality of God, we can behold his finished work. Here is a dear brother who never relied wholly upon God, but went on partially in his own strength, until he has reached this stage and given up and made the mistake which so many are making today. The mistake you look upon as death. This is one of my most cherished terms or phrasings from all of the life and teaching of the Masters of the Far East. They refer to death as a mistake. I love that, because it has so much cultural connotation wrapped into that one simple death is a mistake word statement. This dear soul has not been able to let go of all doubt and fear, and thus he has relied on his own strength and has not been able to finish the work set before all. We should leave him thus. Should we leave him thus, his body will dissolve and he will be again sent forth to finish his mortal task, implying reincarnation, which is all but complete. In fact, so nearly complete is it that we can help him to finish, and we feel this to be a great privilege. You asked if he can again be awakened to full consciousness. Yes, he can, and so can all others who have similarly passed. Though he has passed, as you look upon it, We who have shared a part of his life with him can help, and he will be able to understand quickly so that he may take his body with him. It is not necessary to leave the body to so-called death and dissolution, even after one has apparently made the great mistake. Here the speaker stopped, and for a moment appeared to be lost in deep meditation. In a very short time, 4 of our friends from the village walked into the room. They gathered close together for a few moments, as though in deep thought as well. Then 2 of them reached out their hands and motioned us to join them. We stepped up close, and 2 placed their arms around 2 of our party, and we in turn placed our arms around each other until the circle was complete. The circle extended around the couch that the form of the departed was lying upon. As we stood there for a moment without a word being spoken, the light of the room became brighter. We turned, and Jesus and Pilate were standing in the room together a few steps away. They came forward and joined us. There was another deep silence. Then Jesus stepped forward to the couch and, raising both hands, said, "Dear ones, will you just step through the veil of death with me for a moment? It is not forbidden ground as you think. If you will just step through as we have done and view it from the other side, you will see that it is only what your thoughts have made it. There is life there, the same life that is here." He stood for a moment with outstretched hands. "Dear friend and brother, you are with us and we are with you, and we are all together with God. The sublime purity, peace, and harmony of God surrounds, embraces, and enriches all. This perfection now manifests so vividly to you, O dear one, that you may arise and be received unto your Father. Dear one, you see and know that it is not dust to dust and ashes to ashes, but it is life, pure life, life everlasting. Your body need not be left to mortal dissolution. You now perceive the glory of the kingdom from which you come forth. You may now arise and go to your Father, and the shout goes up, all hail, the newborn one, the risen Lord, the Christ among men." Imagine that here for a second, especially if you come from a religious background that places the sole nomination of the risen Lord upon Jesus. What Jesus Christ, the Christ in Jesus, is saying here is all hail, the newborn one, referring to the older gentleman who has experienced mortal death, or the great mistake as the masters call it. And Jesus, the Christ, is referring to this individual as the risen Lord, the Christ among men, which just absolutely affirms that the Christ is an energy, and that anyone who fans that flame into a full inferno and thus allows for the Christ energy to rule over the flesh man is also the risen Lord, or the Lord that is Christ, having risen up through the vessel that was the individual, trusting solely in their mortal strength or partially in their mortal strength, doing things by the sweat of their own brow, now giving full faith unto the energy that is the Christ, or the creative principle that came from the intelligent awareness, and being amongst the living. Imagine that for a second. Jesus the Christ, referring to the Christ energy that is now manifesting within this soul 100% as the risen Lord. It just completely takes apart any kind of dogmatic, ritualistic, or traditional hang-ups that you may still have about there only being one Jesus Christ, who was the only person to ever have been the risen Lord, quote unquote. The masters have said throughout this book that all of us have the ability to manifest this energy and to be as Christ, because Christ is not specific to one person, i.e. Jesus. The name Jesus is that. It is but a name. There is power in thy name. However, please don't make the mistake of worshiping the idol. Worship the ideal, that which Jesus so perfectly brought about. Dear reader, words are but a travesty when the mortal attempts to picture the beauty and purity of the light that filled that room. And as that form arose, the light seemed to penetrate every object so that nothing cast a shadow, not even the form of our friend or our own bodies. The walls seemed to expand and become transparent until we seemed to be looking into infinite space. The glory of that picture cannot be told. Then we knew that instead of standing in the presence of death, we were standing in the presence of eternal life. Life, unspeakably grand, never diminishing, but going on and on eternally. What could we mortals do but stand and stare? In the uplift of those few moments, we were carried for a time far beyond our most sanguine imagination of heaven and the beauty of it all. It was not a dream, but real. Thus, the real can be greater than any dream. We were privileged to see through and beyond the shadow. The beauty and tranquility of that scene and the great faith we had already placed in our friends carried us completely over the divide that day, and today that divide is but a level plain. Yet, in some way, it was made clear that each one for himself must first scale the heights before the beauty beyond can be seen. Right there it is. Each one for himself must first scale the heights before the beauty beyond can be seen. With every vestige of age gone, our friend, whom we looked upon and raised from the dead, turned towards his associates and in a moment began to speak. These are his words as he stood facing our friends. It is as though they were cast in raised gold upon a tablet which stands always before me. The voice came forth with a majesty that I cannot express. There was no affectation, just a clear, deep note of sincerity and strength. He said, "Dear ones, you cannot know the joy, the peace, the great bliss you have given me in awakening me as you have. Just a moment ago, it was all dark. I stood, fearing to go on, and yet I could not return. The only way that I can explain it is I seemed engulfed in a great blackness, from which I suddenly seemed to awaken, and now I am again with you." Here his face became so radiant with joy that there was no mistaking his sincerity. He turned to us and said, "Dear ones, how I love to think of our association. You can never know the joy it has given me to have clasped your hands, the great joy it has given me to see and know and feel the sincerity with which you have accepted these, my dear helpers, who at this moment I am able to call divine. Could you see through my eyes at this moment, you would be able to know the bliss that I am experiencing. The greatest joy of all is to know so fully that each of you will stand and know just as I am standing and knowing. That joy you will know only when you stand as I stand. I can say that it is well to have lived a full life, to be able to enjoy one moment of this. Then, to think that I can see all eternity unfolding, Do you wonder when I say that my eyes are almost blinded and I am dazed with the revelation? Do you wonder at my great longing to unfold this vision to you, and not only to you, but to every brother and sister in the whole wide universe of God? Dear brothers, if I can lay any transforming hand upon you and lift you to where I stand, it seems that my joy would be multiplied many-fold at this moment. I am shown I must not do that. I am shown that you, yourselves, must stretch forth this transforming hand, and when you have stretched it forth, you will find God's hand ready to clasp yours. You'll be able then to walk and talk with him, and God will eternally bless you as he does all. The greatest joy of all is I am shown that it does not matter what the caste or creed of church, all are welcome. In a moment, he had disappeared from our view, just faded away as it seemed to us. Was this an ethereal vision? All of my associates concluded that it was not, for 2 of them had clasped this man's hand. I leave it to the reader to decide. Then one of our friends from the village turned to us and said, I know that you are doubting, but won't you understand that this was not staged for your benefit? This is but one of the emergencies in our lives, and when the emergency does arise, we are able to come up over that emergency. This dear one had not been able in his own strength to quite surmount the divide, as you call it. In fact, as you see it, he had passed on. The soul had left the body behind, and one so enlightened can be helped at the crucial moment, so that the soul returns and the body finishes its perfection. Then the body can be taken along. This brother longed too ardently to pass on, and he left his body when just a few more steps, as it were, helped it over the divide, and the perfection was complete. The help extended was our great privilege. We slowly withdrew our arms and stood for a full minute in absolute silence. One of our party then broke the silence with these words, "My Lord and my God." As for me, it did not seem as though I would ever want to talk again. I wanted to think. We were all seated, and a few had found their voices and were conversing in low tones. This condition had lasted for 15 or 20 minutes, and nearly everyone was engaged in general conversation, when one of our party walked to the window. He turned and said, there seemed to be strangers arriving in the village. We all went down to meet them, as it was a very rare occurrence for strangers to visit the village at this season of the year and on foot. It was just past midwinter. When we arrived, we found that it was a party from a smaller village about 30 miles down the valley. They had brought a man who had lost his way in a storm 3 days previous and had been nearly frozen. His friends had carried him on a stretcher all that distance through the snow. Jesus stepped close and, placing his hand upon the man's head, stood for a moment. Almost instantly then, the man threw off the wrappings and rose to his feet. His friends, when they saw him stand, stared at him for an instant, then ran from the scene in terror. We could not persuade them to return. The man who was healed seemed dazed and uncertain. 2 of our friends persuaded him to go with them to their homes, while our party, accompanied by Jesus, returned to our quarters. Thus ends the reading of Chapter 3, Book 2, Life and Teachings of the Masters of the Far East. So, let's see now what Take Time to Be Holy has in store for the 21st of April. Just so happens to be Witness to the Resurrection. Did we not just read a resurrection story? And with great power, the apostles gave witness to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus. Acts 4:33, New King James Version. Imagine if we changed the one word at the end of Acts 4:33 to Lord Christ. And with great power the apostles gave witness to the resurrection of the Lord Christ. Now, a little bit inaccurate because Christ is eternal, therefore death does not stain thee. So the Christ necessarily isn't that which is resurrected. But if you want to look at it that way, as the Christ is always within every single one of us, and it is resurrected unto that particular perspective, as it were, or as we see it through our dualistic lens, then wonderful, absolutely. Several years ago, I knelt with a young woman who wanted to be holy. While we were praying, she burst into tears and cried out, "Oh, Jesus!" She had never seen Jesus, never heard his voice, and had no more idea of such a revelation of Jesus to her soul than one born blind has of a rainbow. But she knew him. She had no more need that someone should tell her this was Jesus than you have the need of the light of a candle to see the sun come up. The sun brings its own light, and so did Jesus. Do the masters not continuously bring the light with them into any room or any space which they manifest throughout the life and teachings of the Master of the Far East? She knew him. She loved him. She rejoiced in him with joy inexpressible and full of glory. 1 Peter 1:8, NASB. I'm not exactly sure what New Something Standard Bible. This young woman became a witness for Jesus, a witness that he is not dead but living, and as such a witness to his resurrection. Such witnesses are needed in every age. They are needed today as much as in the days of the apostles. People's hearts are just as wicked, their pride as stubborn, their selfishness as universal, and their unbelief as obstinate as at any time in the world's history. And it takes just as powerful an evidence to subdue their hearts and beget living faith in them as it ever did. So what that last paragraph is saying is that man is as man was, as man or human beings always will be. And in order to overcome that temporary residence as human beings in the animal kingdom unto the God kingdom, or the real human kingdom, which is the next stage of evolution. It is when one has manifest the Christ energy within thee, then one becomes a real human. Real humans are unconditionally loving, and it is through the work of Drunvalel Melchizedek, the Emerald Tablets, Thoth, the Hermes Trismegistus. It is the reason for the quote-unquote fallen state of man into the animal kingdom as human beings, having to work by the sweat of their brow and reproduce by the seed of their loins. The reason for that whole entire condition was our naive, unconditionally loving state as real humans. And as a real human, we are unconditionally loving, but at a certain time in earthly history or worldly universal history, we naively allowed for the ego to take up residence. The ego was a form of energy, if you will, a race of creation, if you will, that we allowed to take residence within our bodies, and thus began the kind of fall into duality where we lost conscious communion with the Lord, with the infinite divine, and took on this sweat of thy brow, trusting in thy strength modality of being in the world. So, with that, the path then paradoxically back towards the divine is to not only recognize that the ego is kind of something foreign, but you could go as far as to say that it is something ethereal, a form of energy, an energy form that we feed. And if we stop feeding it, it will take a back seat, and its kind of power to influence and make decisions will subside. This is the process of allowing for the energy of Christ to rule over the flesh man, instead of allowing for the ego, the process of edging God out, as Dr. Wayne Dyer likes to call it, instead of letting that energy rule over the flesh and make decisions. So, in a pragmatic way, on a day-to-day basis, in your daily life, you can start to introspectively, with the witness consciousness that I've talked about before, begin looking upon your actions that you take on a daily basis and keep a soft score of the ways in which you are loving and in the ways in which your instincts or your impulses or mindless desire and temptation directs the course of your actions. Whenever it is the former, is the latter there, whenever it's the latter, that is the ego somewhat making decisions. And the more time you can spend in a state of loving consciousness, Christ-like way of being, a way like the initiate or the adept or even the masters operate, which is being loving unto others, being loving unto themselves, the more that you can tip the scales towards that unconditionally loving modality way of being, the better you are than you were the day before. And that really is the measuring stick by which we go about this ascension process. Am I more loving, more accepting, and more wise than the day before? And only compare yourself with the person who you were before. And then, as we talked about in yesterday's chapter 2, part 2, let the lessons go once they have been attained, once the goal sought has been attained. So once you are, past whatever it is you're working on, let that go and ardently look for the next level of teaching. Life will ultimately then be your teacher. You'll obtain lessons, you'll work through them. Once you graduate, discard them, ask for the next level of teachings, and keep on trucking. Don't look back. Don't look back. That's my best advice to you as somebody who did look back for a while and rely on the way of his ancestors and the strength and sweat of his own brow for a couple of years after honestly and earnestly beginning this work. Don't look back. It's a waste of time. You get full of doubt, and it's very, very hard work as compared to, as the masters describe this work, nearly, after a certain point, effortless. And as Jesus is going to go on to talk later in this book too, we look upon this work as requiring an immense amount of strength to get over, as the masters call it, the divide. But Jesus goes on to explain that in the cosmic mind, the 10,000 foot view, it is a minute amount of energy. It is a very fine or small amount of energy that it actually takes to get over the divide, to resurrect oneself into the living. And from that point on, you are so magnificently and greatly assisted by the energy of Christ, by the energy of God, by the one cosmic mind, that you make wonderful advances and you're inspired to do them, which I think is honestly the best incentive that we ever have towards making progress unto any endeavor, and that is inspiration. For when we are inspired, we are in spirit, and we are then one step closer to the atonement or the at-one-ment. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Nathaniel J. This has been Alive and Thriving, Book 2, Chapter 3, Life and Teachings of the Masters of the Far East. Namaste.